My father refused to drive one road for 31 years. He told me why the night before he died. He said it like you would pass along a receipt or an instruction, short, flat, as if the words themselves were tools to be kept in order. The hospital room hummed, machines, a fluorescent light that never quite warmed, and he gripped my hand and looked past my shoulder at a place that no longer existed for him. "Close the door," he whispered. "Sit down." Then he began to tell me about the Moor Road. People who knew Alistister called him thorough. He was the kind of man who walked around his lorry like a priest around an altar, checking the chains, testing the floor, listening to the hitch like it might tell him a secret. He kept a logbook with neat entries, dates, milking times, the weight of each beast he loaded. I remember him folding his pen back into his shirt pocket with the same care he used to fold tarpaulins. He could read a trailer the way others read the weather. When he said something was right, it was because he'd turned it over and listened to it. That competence is why none of us laughed when he told the story. If Alistister, who had driven through blizzards and floods and more than one unlit mountain pass, said there was a road you did not take, then you believed him. The Moor Road is a single-track drove across Peat Moor, 12 miles of raised causeway with no lighting and little in the way of landmarks. From the tarmac, you turn onto a ribbon of gravel and heather bound by stone dikes, and if you haven't been warned, the place feels like a country that forgot how to be part of the map. Locals had a name for it in Gaelic. My father didn't know the exact translation, but he said farmers called it the Road of the Carried Dead. It was the sort of name that sticks to you when you hear it in a pub after too much rain. Half joke, half warning. The first time he drove it for work was on a Tuesday in late autumn. He'd been contracted by Drummond to move a flock to Getty's, a neighbouring farm that took in sheep for winter fattening. Drummond came down to the yard with a paper list and a look on his face that didn't belong to someone who'd ever been without his wits. He'd insisted on a late start. "Wait till 4:30, he'd said, and the sun was already softening into that early dusk. They loaded 15 sheep into my father's trailer. He counted them aloud as he walked the pen, 1, 2, 3, like stepping stones across a river. He checked the floors for slippage, made sure the partitions held, fastened the gates until his knuckles whitened. At the wheel he kept the radio low, not because he was religious about silence, but because he liked to hear the trailer settle with the road. He knew the numbers a driver learns, what 12 miles should take at a steady pace, how the cab feels when the suspension is wrong. A normal run down the moor should have been no more than 25 minutes door to gate. On that first crossing it took him 44. At 30 minutes he'd seen a cairn, then another. At 40 minutes he'd passed nothing that made sense. The odometer crawled, and the land around him thickened into a kind of hush that made the hairs on his forearms stand up. When he opened the trailer at Getty's, 2 sheep were limping. One had a deep flank gash. The cuts were clean, razor tidy, like paper slit with a knife, and there wasn't much blood, certainly none pooling inside the trailer. He told me later that he'd opened the partitions and walked through the animals with his hand flat along their backs, feeling for heat, for stiffness, for anything that would explain how a wound that significant could show so little outward mess. There was nothing. The floor was clean. No snagged wool, no tear on the battens. He insisted on doing the checks himself until Getty's waved him off and called men to help. He wasn't the sort to make a fuss, Getty's told me years after, in a voice threaded with impatience and something like alarm. They buried the worst of the injured that night under turf, and Drummond said words to my father that didn't land like a farmer's practical talk. They landed like prophecy. "Finish it," Drummond said. "If you don't finish it, it comes after you." That first time the oddness could have been shrugged off. Bad luck, a mistake, a loose gait. The second time it wasn't so easy to shrug. Before I go on, a word from me. If you like strange, true tales, and you want to hear the rest of this, please subscribe. I promise to tell it straight as my father told it to me. After the first crossing, my father's life began to tilt. Little things shifted, the way light makes a room feel strange after you've been away. He started dreaming the road. He would wake with his hands curled as if on a wheel, and some mornings there was peat on the soles of his boots, though he hadn't set foot outside. My mother noticed it first. She found the mud and laughed it off, then frowned and left the boots on the step in the dark. When she asked him about it, He just looked at the floorboard and didn't answer. The second contract came quicker than you'd expect. Farmers make deals tight in the Highlands. A man's winter will be balanced on the smallness of a margin. Drummond asked for another haul with little ceremony, but this time he gave my father a rattle of instructions that read like counting off a ritual. "Don't stop," he said. "Don't step out. Finish the drove." He handed over a cigarette case empty, as if to remind the driver not to lean on comforts that might betray attention. On the second crossing, the odometer told a story that contradicted the map. At a place where the gauge should have shown 12 miles, the dial read 29. My father swore it out later in a cold way, with the same steady voice he'd used to catalogue engine faults. The trip should be 12, the dial said 29, and he felt something in the air like a lid being put down. There were more injuries, an eye missing in one sheep. The socket clean and dry as if the eye had been lifted out and hidden someplace else. The animals were odd in their silence, not bleating as animals in pain usually do, but sharing a low, waiting hush. When my father opened the trailer at Getty's, again there was no blood in the floor. The fleece was unmarked where it should have been matted. He told me about that missing eye like a man reciting a fatal list. "No blood," he said. "Just the socket. Like someone buttoned it off. I checked the crate. Nothing." He was professional in his assessment. The practical man in him couldn't leave a question unprobed. They examined the field where Drummond kept his flock and found nothing. No tracks leading to a place where a sheep's eye might have been taken. It was as if something had reached in and taken it, without disturbing the world around it. After the second haul, the dreams deepened into a kind of rhythm. He would spoon Pete from the corner of his boot and hold it up like a coin, and sometimes he woke with a taste of iron. My mother insisted he see a doctor for sleep, for stress. He would shake his head and turn his face to the pillow. He started to carry a radio in the cab and leave it tuned to a footnote of static. It steadied him. The men at the garage joked that he drove with a ghost on the passenger seat, and he didn't laugh. There are things that become habits out of fear, and he fell into those the way you fall into a hole in winter you already know. It was about this time Drummond spoke more plainly. He'd always been a man of few words, but when he did speak, his language skated on the border between farming and old belief. "4, he said once when my father pressed him for explanation. 4 crossings. The road likes a clean account. Half a drove leaves it hungry." He didn't elaborate. His eyes watched the yard like a man watching for weather. He'd let slip, too, that a man named Getty's had once found a shepherd lying by the dike, not dead so much as given to the land, stiff, eyes open, a mouth with no water in it. The story came as part rumor, part factual inventory, a man already spoken of in the communal voice of farmers, the kind of mention that should have been a warning and became instead an admonition. My father repeated Drummond's words to me in the hospital as though he were handing me a ledger. "Finish it," he said, "or it'll follow you." He coughed then and watched the pattern of lights on my wristwatch. "You'll join the drove," he told me quietly, and there was a laugh that wasn't a laugh at all. That admission, "You'll join the drove," is one that threaded the whole telling I got that night. It wasn't a prophecy he wanted to hang over me. It was a confession. He'd never heard of anyone named who had simply vanished on the moor, in the way we mean vanish. No investigations, no wagons called to remove bodies. But there were patterns, animals that returned as if walked from some other shore, men found at the side of the road with the glaze of the peat in their hair, odometer dials that could not be trusted. He meant by joining not necessarily that someone was spirited away in full sight, but that the road had a way of keeping accounts. Sometimes the account took meat. Sometimes perhaps it took the man who might have left it unpaid. The first direct sighting was years later, and most people told this part of the story in a shorter way than my father. What he liked to do was tell small things, details that make you trust the man telling you the tale. He told me about the coat. He was driving late, a time when the light is the color of old coins. At about mile 6, the middle of that 12, something walked onto the road. My father said it was the size of a man and carried weight across its shoulders. 3 half-dead sheep hung over it like a stack of damp sacks. It moved with the awkward, unstoppable rhythm of someone carrying a burden that had been carried for a long time. The figure wore a coat, that might once have been a tweed jacket but was now stiff, matted with something that made the fabric look like painted leather. Its gait was mechanical. The knees didn't bend so much as rotate, and the feet slammed a little harder than a human would, like the sound of a gate clapping on hinges. For a moment my father thought it was a man in a twist of bad luck, perhaps a shepherd in trouble, perhaps a procession of strays. Then he saw the face. He said it without drama, the way someone might look down and notice a bruise. The face wasn't a face he was used to. It looked as if it had been squeezed out of peat and preserved. The skin was flaking in places, like dried meat, but there were eyes that held wetness and a kind of ordinary, intent stare. Not blank, intent. Like a man who's looking for the next step, he told me. Behind that figure, an impossible procession followed, a handful of sheep, pale and tight in their coats, as if they'd been packed with cold, moving with the same mechanical step. They looked neither dead nor alive the way the frozen corpses in bogs look preserved between times. My father watched them fall into a cadence, and then, because the trailer shelf in his own head is full of bad options, he heard one of the creatures make a sound. Sheep scream the way a mouth can when it hasn't a more clever noise. But this wasn't a normal animal sound. It was a thin, out-of-place cry that levered at something in my father's chest. He said the sound made him slam the accelerator, even though his hands shook on the wheel. The trailer rattled, the engine pitched up. The thing with the coat did not look at him. It kept walking, bearing its cargo with the stubborn industry of a man carrying kindling. He passed it. He could not tell me if he exceeded any safe speed. The cab has a way of turning measurements into memory. What he told me clearly was the way the air snapped afterward, as if the open mouth of the landscape closed. He felt the sort of relief you feel after a bad fever breaks, but it sat in him like a stone. For days he could not shake the image of that face. He reported what he'd seen to Gettys. Gettys touched his jaw and asked him if he'd been drinking. The village enjoys a hard, dry comfort in blaming ale and weather, and then moving on. My father was not a drunk. Gettys accompanied him back to the field the next night by lantern. Between them, they found one of the injured animals from that first trip. It had been buried shallow, and then something had disturbed the grave. The turf flaked like scabbed paint. When they opened it, they found things rearranged. My father described it with his hands as if he were pointing at invisible entrails. Not eaten, moved, like someone tidied the insides and set the body wrong. He didn't linger over the image. He never had to. The men in the yard shoveled the earth back in without fuss. The sense of menace changed too. Before, the road had been an oddity, an inconvenient, unnerving stretch that made drivers check their mirrors. Afterwards, it felt like a ledger with its own rules, and the men who worked it became careful in a way that looked close to a devotion. They began to say prayers half under their breath, not to any god in particular, but to the memory of the road. People in the village would nod as if remembering a debt. That night in the hospital, my father coughed and turned his face so that his mouth cleared. He held my hand and said, "You know, when you think about roads, you think about getting from A to B. That's the trick." He let the sentence hang there. Some roads don't like an account left open, they keep tally. It would be easy to let the story stop there. One strange figure, a procession of pale sheep, a man with peat on his boots, who began to sleepwalk toward the story. But the Moor Road, as my father told it, did not stop at oddities. It escalated into orders of strange that you notice only because the mundane things, like an odometer or a watch, keep failing at the same time. He described a later crossing where the engine itself seemed to struggle in a way he'd not known an engine could. The cab filled with a low, whining pressure, as if a distant wind had gathered under the chassis. The radio went dead, not with a pop, but with a soft, pulling silence. He checked everything he could: fuel, battery, the belts. All of it read normal. The odometer, however, told a different story. When he reached the turning for Gettys, the gauge said the trip had run to 47 miles. That number in his telling had the same finality as some dates. He'd asked aloud, "How?" and the road gave no answer. There were other things he couldn't abide. The trailer arrived sealed at one delivery with 15 ticked on the sheet and only 14 presented. No one could explain it, he told me. They opened the trailer at Gettys to count, and found a perfect order, partitions snug, gates latched, yet one sheep was simply not there. There was no sign of forced entry, no scratch at the latches, and no footprints in the turf to suggest a third party had taken it. It was as if the road had said, "You brought one too many and taken what it wanted," my father said, careful to caveat his words. He never said the road did it. He said it seemed that way. When Drummond turned up at the yard after that delivery, he was paler than usual. A few weeks later, Drummond was found lying by the side of the moor, not in a position that suggested he had been assaulted, but splayed in a way that made the villagers speak of exposure and error. He was dead by all accounts. No wound, no blunt force trauma, nothing that made the coroner's note read like a story. They said it was exposure. They said he had likely gotten lost and succumbed. My father did not argue with that. What he said was that Drummond's face had in its last hours the same look as the man my father had seen carrying the sheep, an absorbed, distant focus like watching the next step. After that, my father stopped driving the moor. He put the keys under the mat and let younger men take the runs. He took to sleeping with the radio under his pillow and walked the yard at 3 in the morning to make sure gates were latched. He kept his word for 31 years. And then, in the hospital room with the machine light and the smell of disinfectant, he told me the one part he had never said aloud to anyone else, that sometimes in the dark nights he would dream he was behind the wheel and someone, some procession, was walking beside him, not to take him outright, but to count him like a shepherd counts his flock. He told me it felt like being added to a list, and lists are the kind of thing men like us notice. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again they were wet without tears. "I don't know what it wants," he said. "Maybe it isn't wanting anything. Maybe it's keeping its own rules. But it takes things." He said the last part slowly, as if choosing each word. "Sometimes it's sheep, sometimes it's men, sometimes it's the number that makes the difference." I sat with that confession and held his hand while the machines keep a steady voice under the hospital ceiling. He smiled then, just a small lift at one corner of his mouth, and said, "You will have my logbook. Burn it if you like." The laugh that followed was a dry resignation. "But if you go near that road, remember the count. There is a way these stories end in towns, with an exorcism, a petition to some authority, an explanation that reclaims the phenomenon for the comfortable." My father wanted none of that. He wanted me to know that things exist around us that follow rules we do not understand. He wanted me to know that he had been marked in a soft way by what he'd seen. When he fell silent, when the machines took over the thin breath he could no longer manage, his fingers loosened around mine, and his hand was cool. I sat there a long time after, thinking about odometers and peat and a face like a bog body that carried its burden across the middle of the road. I went back to the yard in the weeks after the funeral. Men go back to the places you tell them not to, not because we're braver, but because we are stubborn about proving things to ourselves. I climbed up into his cab and ran my hand along the dash. The truck smelled faintly of leather and dust and something older that hung in the cracks of the seat. On the inside of the windshield, where a hand might have scraped in a moment of panic, there were 4 faint vertical scratches, small and thin like fingernails scored in the glass. I stood there looking at those marks and tried to imagine what they'd meant in his hands. Had the thing brushed the cab? Had the nails slipped? Or had those scratches always been there, a part of the truck's private map? It is a bad habit in small towns to let coincidence become an omen, but when you spend your life watching counts and temperatures, you begin to notice when the readings don't match. I did not drive the moor road then. I avoided it the way one avoids a house where something bad happened. Friends told me I was foolish. Others said perhaps the road was a memory worn into the land like a furrow, and the men who travelled it at the wrong times felt its old memory like a draught. Some suggested the strange injuries were the work of poachers, of bad lads with knives. I will not pretend to know. What I do know is this: the ledger that road kept had a way of making men careful, and when you are careful, you are sometimes the most trustworthy witness of things that are discreet and patient. The night I left the yard after inspecting the scratches on my father's truck, the sky was the flat grey of a November that can't decide if it will snow. I drove past the turn for the moor without slowing, and felt a small irrational relief, like the unclenching of a jaw. The road in the small hours looked exactly as it had every time I'd seen it from the tarmac, a thin knife of grey between two darker shapes of field. It did not seem to be eating time at that moment. It was just a road. Still, when I came home, I slept badly. In the mornings there were fresh prints on the step where no one had walked, faint depressions in the turf that suggested something heavier than a man had passed between my shed and the hedge. My mother suggested I was making evidence to suit a tale. She told me to go back to work. I told her I would, but I did not. There are things I have not said here because they don't yet fit the ledger of what happened. There are times when the roads taking seem to be a kind of arithmetic. If you left a crossing unfinished, the landscape came after what you'd left unpaid. But there are other nights when the taking was stranger, as if the moor kept both a hunger and a patience. It took its time with our family. A mutilated sheep, a man found on the dike, a truck with 4 faint scratches on the glass. It took something from Drummond in a way that looks like exposure when you write it on paper, and looks like a warning when you say it aloud. I find myself thinking about the animals most. We lost 15 in a way that we could count only in absences. You can measure nothing by the things that are present. Absence is a different kind of fact. The farmers made a note of the numbers, 15 loaded, 14 signed in, and then started to look at the middle road as if one more crossing might fix the imbalance. But balance is the sort of word you use when you do not wish to confront a ledger with teeth. When Alistister told me about the man carrying the sheep, he spoke with an underside of regret. He had a look that said he had expected, somewhere in his knotted, weathered blood, to be able to stand up to what the land reminded him of. He had thought his skills, notion of checking doors, counting animals, keeping numbers straight, would be enough to protect him. That hubris is the thing that makes men tell the stories in the first place, the admission that we are small in the face of older rules. I will tell you one more thing before I stop this part of the tale. The night after the first figure, when Gettys and my father dug the animal up and resealed the grave, there was a procession in the sky, thin, low clouds that moved together like a line of something alive. The men stared at it and said nothing. Weather, Bade and Honest seemed to be attentive. In the village, people began to stop going out alone on those moor roads after dark. A superstition settles when enough of us find the same thing true. That is where I will leave you for now. The moor road is a place people still drive, though with caution. They tell the numbers differently. The story changes with the teller. I tell it as my father told it to me on his last night, because I believe the truth of his manner matters more than the neatness of a narrative. He was a man who counted things, and if he said a road keeps its accounts, I am inclined to believe him. There is a mouthful of silence in that, like a space a tooth once filled. The ledger is unfinished. The rest of what happened after those early encounters is tangled and messy, and it involves more trips, more checks, and one last crossing that my father could never bring himself to take. It is a crossing that ends perhaps in something that we could call a disappearance, but that is not a word I would pin down without care. For now the road waits in the moor. The numbers sit in my father's logbook, folded among the receipts and signatures. I keep them close, not because I think I will solve the thing, but because I think truth sometimes demands the company of witness. I kept the logbook in a tin box under my workbench for a month, turning the pages with the careful slowness people reserve for things that might break if handled too quickly. The entries are his, dates, times, numbers in a tidy hand that never once flattered itself. They don't explain the moor, they only mark it. There is a paper slip folded between August and September where he has penciled the word unfinished and nothing more. I carried that slip in my pocket until the winter stole the heat from my palms. After the funeral I went back more than once. I spoke to men who had taken runs on that road when my father wouldn't. They told versions of his story with less patience for detail and more appetite for the telling. In a pub you can make a ledger into a legend quicker than you can light a match. I asked questions that were small and useful. Did the odometer read odd? Did the trailer show marks where there should be none? Did anyone ever find a carcass disturbed and put back wrong? Some answers were practical. Loose fittings, bad gates. Others were the kind you fold into a pocket and keep for when the night gets long. A farmer who found 2 sheep lined up like sentries on a ditch. A lad who swore he'd seen a man walk across the road with nothing but a sack and a blank stare. There is a habit among us, Farmers, hauliers, people who spend their lives negotiating the plain facts of weight and weather, of turning the strange into the merely explicable. You do it to keep living. People suggested explanations that were small and plausible. Poachers, coyotes, mistakes. I don't deny any of those things might have been true sometimes, but a list of plausible causes still wouldn't account for the things that happened with clocks and dials and doors that arrived shut when the count said they shouldn't be. My father's notebooks gave me more than numbers. They gave me the rhythm of his thinking. He had notes about checks, about the little creaks a gate makes when it's about to fail, about which of his hinges had a habit of winking in damp weather. He had a margin note on one Thursday in November. Not right, air like a lid. Beside it, a scribbled figure. 47. There are other marginalia. Peat taste. Boots muddy, no walk. Getty's alarmed. He had underlined finish twice, and then crossed the word out as if trying to stop himself from making a command performative. At the yard the truck was kept, as if the thing itself might be a witness. Men joked about it, of course, the way men do with things too soft to name. One of the young lads who now drives that route told me he respects the turn for the moor the way you respect an old ditch, with care and a decision not to test it. He showed me the log for a run in which the odometer swung like a temper. 12 miles told 29 mappies, no stop. The manner of that entry looked like handwriting that had been hurried. He wouldn't meet my eye when he pointed out the row of signatures from Getty's, 15 ticked, 14 presented. It was in the course of one of these visits that Getty's told me about the last crossing my father had made, before he finally refused to take the runs at all. Getty's didn't mean for it to be dramatic. He recited facts the way a man might recite a list of necessary tools, the timing, the weather, what they'd eaten for supper, but the facts, once stitched together, made a picture that sat heavy in me. It had been a thin clearing of late light when my father hit the turn for the moor. There was talk of debt and of cattle feed prices, and of a winter that had eaten too many margins. We weren't rich. We never were. There are decisions men in my father's job make under pressure, because another season without the money can be ruinous. He had agreed to one more run to help a cousin with a lambing, or perhaps to steady a neighbour's account. I still find his reasons sensible when I say them to myself, and yet I know the thing that pushed him was always practical, never theatrical. Practical people don't walk willingly into superstition, they step where they must. He left later than the first 3 trips had been made. The sky had that colour that belongs to old coins and tired metal. He remembered the time on the watch more than the thermometer. The radio sat on its usual station, a background of voices that threaded the night. The trailer was loaded with 15, arranged in partitions he'd spaced like prayer. He ran his hands along the battens with the same motion he'd used 1,000 times, checking, listening, he told me later, with the slow economy of a man listing engine faults, that everything felt ordinary until it didn't. At mile 6, he passed the cairn and thought nothing of it. He told me in the hospital how he saw the road sharpen before him, like the tongue of a knife catching for a moment on edge. At some point, no grand curtain, no electric pulse, the engine's voice changed. It didn't seize like a motor does when it is choked with water. It lost a steadiness, a regularity that he could feel in the soles of his feet. The gauge read fuel and oil and temperature the way they'd always done. The cab hummed the way it always hummed. There was no mechanical smell except a faint scent of peat that by that hour should have been on his boots, not in the air. He caught himself speaking aloud, "All right," as if to sound a steadying note. Then the radio swallowed to nothing. Not the quick static death that you've heard in other nightmares. This was more like the sky taking a breath out of the cab. The voice in the speakers slumped into inaudibility, leaving a silence so full it felt as if sound itself had been rented out elsewhere. He cut the engine in a reflex, then flicked the key and tried again. The gauges read normal. The battery showed a steady blue. The belts sat like taut ribs. The truck answered, but the answer was thin, like paper that had been folded too often. He drove on because that's what you do. He had miles to cover and a man in the yard expecting him. The odometer rolled and rolled in the manner of ugly jokes, and when he looked later, the number had climbed twice the length it ought to have. He spoke it out. 47 miles. He told me he said it not as a cry, but as a fact. The word hung in the cab like something with weight. When the engine finally went soft, more a dropping of energy than a death, the truck coasted into a shoulder the color of old sand. He put it in neutral and put his foot on the brake. The air was a kind of thin that makes your gums tense. There were no birds in the hedgerows. The cab felt like a small boat with the tide out. The procession came up the road before him, like a train of pale weather. He couldn't be sure how many walked in front of him, because the thing that led them, if it can be called a man at all, drew his sight the way a wound draws a hand. This figure crossed the road with a stack of bodies across its shoulders, and behind it the sheep followed in step as if their feet had been set to a metronome. They moved with utter composure. The sound they made was not quite a bleat, not quite a breath. It was a thin, tight noise that tugged the inside of his chest. What he felt then was a small, animal kind of terror that made his hands rigid. He told me he didn't want to move, because movement would draw a notice he couldn't meet. He whispered to himself the names of his daughters like a litany, small things that keep the terrible from reaching into parts of us that we still think are private. He thought if he let himself look away, he might be allowed past. Then the thing with the coat walked to the side of the cab. It placed its burden, 3 pale, slack sheep, on the verge like a man laying down tools. The face, my father said, was the thing that stopped his breath. It wasn't blank. There were eyes and a mouth shaped in proportions that suggested a face had once tried to be human there, but the skin had a dullness like wood washed down a river too many seasons. It looked at him the way a butcher looks at the animal that will be the day's meat, not cruel, not kind, only assessing. It lifted a hand and pressed its fingers to the glass. 4 marks scraped the inside of the windshield in a motion my father described as both a warning and a reckoning. He heard the sound as if someone had taken a nail and raked it slowly across the pane. He felt the metal beneath his hand respond in sympathy. The fingers left long vertical furrows small as his wife's sewing needle had once made in leather. He felt the movement in his teeth. He started the engine without thinking. It coughed and then accepted the motion, and the cab rolled forward. The procession didn't turn its head. The thing with the coat kept its slow, useless walk. The sheep followed in line. He drove on because nothing else presented as an option. When he pulled in at Getty's, the men there counted and signed. The paper said 15. The pen said 14. They opened the trailer because Getty's insisted, because a man whose life is made of counting is a natural skeptic of almost every convenience. The partitions were snug. The gates showed no sign of tampering. There was no blood where blood should have been. There was no foot trail to the hedgerow that belonged to someone who'd taken an animal by hand. They walked the yard with torches and dogs that nosed the ground and found nothing. "Somebody's taking the numbers," Getty said, his voice a hammer in the gloom. "Men will make metaphors of anything because they prefer to make drama out of economics. They talked of thieves and wolves and miscounts, of every human failing they could imagine, and yet each account kept meeting the same headache. The animal that should have been there wasn't, and the paper still said 15. Drummond came out to look at the paper and watched the men as though he were looking for a reflection. A fortnight later, he was found near the dike, splayed as though he'd simply decided to lie down on the shoulder of the moor and let the cold take him. There were no marks, no plunder, no evidence of a struggle. The coroner put down exposure. People shrugged because nature is a convenient silence. My father didn't shrug. He said he could tell by the look of the man's hands, folded as they'd been, that there had been a fixation there, a flatness of the mouth that looked an awful lot like the way the thing had looked at the cab. He said it like someone tasting something unsweetened. After that night he stopped going. He locked the keys away and made a small vow to himself that had the weight of a prayer. He would be present in yard and field and auction, but he would avoid the moor. That was a modest, stubborn sort of defiance. He didn't try to argue the road out of being what it was. He didn't start a petition or a meeting. He kept his oath by doing the smallest possible rebellion. He did not put rubber on that gravel again. Years went by. He grew more careful in ways that looked like habit. He kept the radio tuned to a constant channel and was irritated by dead air like a man irritated by a scrape on a precious surface. He wouldn't go out alone at night. He ate his soup with the light slightly on. He slept in clothes that he could grab and step into. These habits cost him small comforts and bought perhaps a thin line of reprieve. I watched him change. It was slow and steady and full of regrets that had nothing to do with other men. He refused to tell me everything. People seldom tell their children where their fear began because they think their children will use what they know about fear to keep score. But little fragments came out like coins dropped at the edge of his hand, a soldier's rhythm in his thumbs on the steering wheel, a pause before he stepped over a threshold, a way he would listen to the land as if it might answer back. He told me once that when he dreamed the road he wasn't always frightened. Sometimes the dream had a quality of business-like work to it, as if the night expected its accounts closed. It is easier to imagine the moor as something that takes out of spite or hunger, if you like a tidy villain. My father never described it that way. He described it as something meticulous, patient, and indifferent to blame. It kept a tally for reasons we don't know. It did not need to be cruel to be awful. Other people in the district started to mark their own reckonings. There were farmers who refused one route or another, not because they'd been told myth, but because they'd looked at a list of returns and found a hole. You might think economies would police themselves, that loss would lead to insurance or appeals. In practice, there is a communal forgetting that settles over these places like low cloud. People make compromises. They chalk a loss as weather or theft and carry on. But there were corners of our community where the moor's name grew teeth. You don't go out near the moor on a night like that, the women say still, almost as an aside when they pass you a kettle. Not if you value your wits. Rumour folded around the edges of what we knew. Young men told louder versions of the tale at wakes, embellishing the pace and the terror to suit the beer. Old women in the market spoke of a shepherd found with peat in his hair, staring at something none of us could see. A few claimed in a low way that once there had been a wandering vagrant who'd simply disappeared the night he took the road. No body, no sign, only his coat ungathered on a dike. I have not written such claims into the logbook. I mention them because they feed the way a community looks at its own margins. They are rumors, repeated and softened, not facts vouched in court. You will notice, if you read the papers of the county, that there is a neatness to official reports. Drummond's death is logged as exposure. A missing man, if one had been recorded, would be filed under a case of gone. There are thresholds of proof we live by. Witness accounts like my father's sit awkwardly against them because they are by necessity partial and human. There was one thing my father did that he kept from almost everyone. He prepared for the possibility of being counted. He made a small kit of practical things, rope, a warm blanket, a torch with new batteries, and put it in a metal biscuit tin in the truck. He left a list of instructions for my mother about the logbook and the keys. Perhaps this was superstition. Perhaps it was simply prudence. Maybe both things can be true at once. In the last year of his life, when his body was less cooperative and his hands had started to shake in ways that were not wholly from age, he sat me down and took my hand in a way that made me feel like one of those things you check for faults. He wanted me to know the way the counts matter. He wanted me to understand how numbers hold a place in a life typified by measure. "If you ever have to go," he said, tapping the logbook with a finger that left an oil mark, "leave the radio on. Do not step out, check the partitions twice. And if it says 15 on the paper, check the bodies yourself. Don't just sign away the numbers." He said it plainly, like instruction for new machinery. "Why do you think it does what it does?" I asked him once. "Because when you have a ledger and someone else who keeps it, curiosity is a natural, almost professional itch." He looked at me with a long, tired patience. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe it's old, maybe it's a memory in the land. Maybe it's nothing you or I should try to understand. The only thing I know is that it takes. Sometimes I'll sit up and hear the road in my head. It's not loud, it counts in a voice like the heel of a boot. Those words, 'it counts,' became the rhythm of my thinking in the months after his death. I would find myself checking the pantry, then the ledger, then the fence posts, as if I could persuade the world to be less porous by making sure I'd noticed everything that might be taken. That compulsion is its own kind of haunting. It taught me a modest humility, that some things are simply too patient for us to outrun. Once, before I closed the truck's door for the last time, before I put the logbook back in the tin, I ran my palm over the inside of the windshield and felt the raised, clean edges of the 4 scratches he'd told me about. They were there, tiny and precise, as if someone had drawn a small barcode across a glass. I thought of other barcodes and lists, and how they are meant to be read by machines for efficiency. This was different, a tally carved by a mittened hand that did not quite belong to this century. People will ask when you tell a story like this whether you believe in the thing itself. I hesitate to say I know. What I do know is the way my father's hands told me the truth of the matter. He had seen something that rearranged him. For 31 years he lived with the residue of that night, habits, rituals, a kind of learned caution. That is evidence in the only sense that certain particulars can be evidence, the change in a man. You can, of course, chalk his changes to ordinary grief, or to a personality that had a dash of nervousness in it from the start. I have considered those readings. My father was not without temperament. He had quirks of counting and worrying that belonged to the job. He would cross a bridge and count the planks when he was anxious. These are the sorts of things neighbors use to dismiss tragedy. A man is simply built a certain way. But I keep thinking about the neatness of the cuts on those first animals, the way the world offered wounds that didn't quite behave like wounds, and about the way doors arrived shut when the boxes said they should not be. There is, too, the human cost, Drummond's family, the way a name can be reduced to ledger and then to a phrase like found by the dike. People talked around the man for months afterward in a way that made him less of a person in memory and more of a token of warning. I think of his children sometimes when the afternoon lies long enough to let me think of those other people's losses. Rumour does violence to grief by turning it into lesson. I also think about the sheep. Perhaps that sounds strange, animals instead of humans, but they are easier to count and less likely to be given poetic weight. We load them, we feed them, we make simple economies of their lives. To have one vanish without trace is to experience a kind of arithmetic that refuses to total. The ledger closes wrong, 15 becomes 14, and the gap is a poor substitute for answers. I've walked the moor once since I stopped driving past it. I did so in the daytime and with another man's company, because people do not walk into old stories alone without something like bravery or foolishness. The gravel was the exact sound you'd expect, a dry whisper under boots. The moor breathed peat and iron. The cairns stood like teeth. We walked that central ribbon, and our voices felt small and out of place. At the centre we paused and looked up at the sky, low grey, full of patient cloud, and I felt the odd sense you get when the world is perfectly ordinary and you expect it to be the opposite. The ground betrayed nothing. There were no marks of the procession I had been told about as a child. That absence is itself a kind of presence. People in the village will tell you there are nights when the road feels hungrier than others, and that others of the older set will avoid it when the moon rides low. Travel advice, perhaps. And yet something in the town's movement around the moor feels like an acceptance. It is part superstition, part economy, part the human strategy of folding fear into habit. I keep my father's logbook folded into the tin. Sometimes I take it out and run my finger along his entries. His handwriting is a map of him. When the nights are long and the wind is a thing that remembers stone, I read the numbers aloud like a measure. 25 minutes, 44 minutes, 47, and the sounds of them settle like shells in my mouth. Reading them aloud is a small form of witness. It is my way of keeping the ledger walked with me. People ask me if I will ever drive the moor. Friends, skeptics, and a few who were close ask, because it is a reasonable question to want an end to a tale. The truth is, I don't think the road needs to be driven by me to remain what it is. Roads are made of other people's habits and our shared forgettings. If a place keeps account, it does not do so only for one family. Sometimes at night I will find myself thinking about the man who carried the sheep, about the hands on the glass, about the small, patient voice of a road that keeps accounts. I will imagine, absurdly, a town meeting where we present the road with a balance sheet and agree the debt is paid. The image is comic because the moor is not a bank. It is a thing older and more indifferent. There is also a practical part of me that wants to catalogue every plausible explanation and lay them out like coins. Mechanical error, theft, misreporting, the psychology of fatigue, the communal power of stories. All of these things likely played a part in the events we lived through. They do not, to my taste, fully account for the experience of my father, his dreams, the marks on the glass, the sealed trailer with a sheep thread missing, the way men in the yard moved after nightfall. The world is seldom a single answer. It is a braided thing. If I had a closing word of counsel, it would be this: pay attention to counts. It is a small and unromantic kind of wisdom. We are all in trades of measure, whether our tools are scales or spreadsheets or the sound of an engine. When your numbers don't add up, notice it. There's a social force that wants to smooth bumps into acceptable losses. That force is useful. It also makes us forget what might be worth asking about. When I tell this to people, some ask me if I think the road takes people. The honest answer is that I don't know. There was Drummond on the dike, and there's the animal that didn't come back, and there's a string of measurements that refuse tidy summation. There are also whispers of other departures that may be nothing more than weltering rumour. I mark them as rumours because rumour grows in the places where explanation fails. I think it is fair, though, to say this. The moor is a place where loss is often counted, sometimes loudly and sometimes in the hush between machines. Whether those losses are natural, criminal, or something else is a question I cannot answer with certainty. If you're still with me, I will close with what my father asked me to pass on. He spoke into a night that had already thinned his patience for long answers. He wanted me to keep the ledger he kept, not because he believed in its magic, but because he trusted numbers in a world that often refuses to be sensible. He wanted me to say the small things he didn't think he could afford to forget. A radio on, the partitions checked, the gates latched, the log signed with inflation that matched the loading. Those are practical things. They are also perhaps a kind of defiance against a landscape that cares for its own rules. If you believe these things are signs of superstition, then you have my blessing. If you believe them to be warnings, perhaps keep your wits. If you find the story interesting and you want to hear other people's accounts, strange work stories, field tales, things that sit uncomfortably at the edge of measure, subscribe and share. If you've got a similar ledger, a lost number you can't make right, send it in. I will listen. I will keep count. There is, at the center of stories like this, a simple human ache. We do not like unfinished accounts. They sit in our teeth and catch the night. The moor road kept its own accounts in a way our townsmanship had not bargained for. Perhaps one day someone will put a light there or run a committee, or make a thorough survey and close the file by persuading the ledger to balance. Until then, we do what people do. We live with the knowledge that the land holds histories we cannot wholly read, and sometimes it returns what is owed in ways that look like accidents and sometimes like reckonings. One last thing. I still see in the corner of my eye sometimes the raised edge of those 4 little marks on the windshield. They are small enough to be dismissed and precise enough to be noticed. They are, more than anything else, a witness I can show you. An index of a moment that my father carried inside him until it changed the way he lived. If you ever find yourself on a long, thin drove of gravel with peat on either side and the sky low, remember the count. Keep the radio on. Count your beasts. Keep your hands where you can trust them. And if you have a story you think belongs in the ledger, send it my way. I will listen, and I will add it to the margins with the care of a man who knows how to keep numbers and how to hold the quiet that comes after them.